Which there's a delay. Please work. Okay, there we go. So today we're going to be talking about We the People, Chapter 12. So I'm going to give the live stream audience a second to open up the in Web Campus the file for Chapter 12. It's the Congress chapter. I want to say that we are on track. So if there's anything you believe I missed or I didn't cover or you want to discuss in more detail, remember I have office hours twice a week. So they're virtual office hours. You contact me and I will meet with you. Because our virtual office hours don't have to be at the same time that my virtual office hours, right? My virtual office hours are 12:45 to 1:45, but trying to get from where I'm at to here in 15 minutes is proven very difficult. So if you need a different time, or if you just want to discuss via email, or you wanted to get some chat, right? I will open up a chat. There is a chat in the web campus, but that's public for everyone. If you want to have a group discussion at some point, right, we can do that. If you want to have some sort of collaborative effect, talk to me about it. You have a paper that's due soon and an exam. So the exam is on the 5th of November. Because the exam is on the 5th of November and the election is on the 3rd, right, I am going to give you a 72-hour window, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. I'm up until the 3rd, I'm going to offer you extra credit. So if you can show that you voted, right? Remember, don't show me how you voted, but show that you turned in the ballot, right? Give me some evidence, right? It is a bit of an honor system, but I trust you. And I actually care less about the extra credit. Like if I give you extra credit, that's one thing. It's not that big a deal to give some extra credit who didn't deserve it. I want you to go vote, right? It's more important to me that you vote than the extra credit. So it's an honor system. I want to encourage you to go vote. And encouraging you to go vote is the most important part, right? If you have, in the rare case where you can't vote for whatever reason that is, and you don't really want to discuss it with me, you can show me some other form of political activism and I'll count that, right? Because I don't want you to have to admit to something, right? Because I was thinking about it, there has to be an exception, right? One, there are students at this university who are under 18, so they can't legally vote. And then two, there are students at this university that we intentionally protected, right? DACA is a program that UNLV really supported up until 2016. And even after 2016, there was a big argument to support DACA students. So if you can't vote and you can't get extra credit because you can't vote because our pathway to citizenship is set up in such a way that you didn't know you came here from another country as a child, I don't want to punish you, but you have to show me that you're engaged in political activism, and it has to be offline, right? You can't show me that you're part of a Facebook post. I don't want it to be online. I want it to be offline. What have you done offline, right? Are you voting? Are you mailing? Did you write a letter, right? A paper letter to a congressman? Are you informed in the issues? Give me something that I can justify the extra credit. The extra credit for voting, I want it to be worth a lot. So it is worth 1% of your grade. You get a full point, right? And the class is out of 100 points. So you get a 1% bump on whatever it is in this class that you have. You get an extra percent for showing me that you're politically active. That's how important it is to me that you vote, right? Not how you vote. I don't want that information. Please do not give me information, right? We talked about this last time. I really hope the live stream is still working because I accidentally went to the wrong setup. But just make sure that you are politically active, right? We are in the middle of one of the worst, right, pandemics, right? It's the worst disease, virus or spread of disease in the last 100 years in the US, but it may be the worst, even worse than that last pandemic, right? There was less consequences then than there is now, right? So you're in the middle of something that the government is very involved in, and there are very big discussions about how the government should be involved. And I'm not taking a side. I want to be very clear, I am not taking a side, right? You could think that that's not the government's role. I talked about Reagan before. Reagan had famously said, the worst thing that you can hear is, I'm here to help, I'm from the government, right? So you have Reagan on one side, you have two different choices, but the choice is incredibly important, so make the choice, be part of that choice. And we're in Nevada, which is a battleground state. You have a lot of other votes, right, on initiatives, on candidates, on local candidates. Your voice really matters, and historically, young people have not voted, right? So try and break from that trend, because once you vote once, it becomes tradition, it becomes conditional, right? You get used to voting. So that's very important, and everyone's grade will go up a percentage. Whatever your grade is now, you can just add a percent to that moving forward, right? Which is a lot of extra credit. Compared to most classes, it's quite a bit of extra credit. The other part is that the day for early submission is Thursday. That's the last day you can turn in a paper early and get extra credit. It's not the last day you can turn in a paper early and get a review. So if you turn it in by this Thursday, I will give you 10% extra credit, right? So it's out of 22 points. I'll give you an extra 2 points on that, right, to turn it in early. And then I will review it. I will tell you what grade it would have gotten and tell you what you need to do to get a better grade. So that's an option that you have for next Thursday. If you don't get it in by next Thursday, but you still want me to review it, because I am the harshest on the paper, you have all this time to do the paper, you have the benefit for the review, right? One of the things about writing is that you have the most benefit review, so you can go back through and write and rewrite. If you don't get it in by Thursday, but you send it to me Friday, I may not give you the extra credit, but I will still review it. In fact, up until the paper is due on the 12th, up until the 10th, if you give me the paper by the 10th, on the 11th, I will go through and I review anything that's submitted before that period of time, and I will give you a grade. After the 10th, and let's say after class on the 10th, once we have class, that's the deadline, right? Once I show up, that's the deadline for you to have submitted it. On the 10th, when I show up, after that, any submissions are final submissions, right? I will not review those after that point. I am a very harsh grader on these papers. I'm going to say it again because every semester everyone's surprised. I have what's called a grade floor. If you write a paper and it's bad, I had your initial grade floor, which is a D. It's 12 out of 20. I have given a third of my students a 12 out of 20 in most classes. I'm very difficult on the paper. I'm warning you ahead of time. I'm telling you right now that the reason I have a grade floor is if I didn't have that, most people would get an F on the paper, right? It very rarely in this class meets the standards that I expect. It is a short paper, right? Only one line into the 5th page. It's double spaced. People still do not manage to do this. Make sure you're getting this done. If you don't do it, the likelihood that you fail this class is very, very high, right? You can't just give up 20% of a full class. We are wrapping up for an exam. So elections on Tuesday, and then an exam on Friday, and then the week after that, the paper's due. Right now is crunch time. Because of that, I have 5 assignments that are in. I believe 5 assignments are in. We were gonna have 10. I'm not gonna do the other 5. I'm just gonna let you guys off the hook. So I'm just gonna double the number of points, the value of the 5 assignments that we did. I am gonna post a review assignment on the 3rd. It is not worth points, but I still want you to have the, I'm gonna give you the benefit of review so you can look through the questions and maybe take it a couple times if you wanna get prepared. So you have the benefit of review, but I'm not gonna count towards your grade because it's my fault, not yours, that I didn't have more assignments posted. The last assignment was supposed to be due on the 3rd. I'm not going to try and cram 5 assignments into the semester because we already have so much there, right? So whatever assignment's worth, I'm going to double the points. You're going to see them double the points wise, right? So don't be worried about that. The last part before we get into the lecture is how do I calculate your grade, right? Because the way your grade looks on it is very different from the way I calculate your grade. And I'm not going to show you my grade book because that violates a bunch of rules, right? But there are 4 exams. I take the top 3. This is German 3. It's like I think you guys do this. I do this, but just don't be confused by that, right? 4 exams, I take the top 3. So what you do is you take your best 3 exams and you add them up, right? Take your best 3 exams, you add them up. Then you're going to add your paper grade. So best 3 exams, paper grade, assignments. You add those things together, that's your grade, right? That's all you do because it's out of 100 points. I made the course out of 100 points. So if you just add all the things you did together, that will give you your grade. If you have a 93.1, you have an A in my class, right? After 3 exams. That's why I'm telling you this, because after the 3rd exam, if you have a 93.1, you have an A in my class. And I'm going on record, I'm recording this. So if this becomes a problem later on, if they punish me for it, they can punish for it. That's how strongly I believe this. If you have a 93.1 after the 3rd exam and you do well on the paper, and then at the last 2 weeks of the semester, you say, I don't want to take the final and I want to rededicate myself to anatomy or mathematics or whatever it is that I am, that is an option that every student in my class has. And I can get punished for that or whatever happens, I'm not worried about that. I know that we are ramping at the end of an incredibly difficult semester with all of these complications. And if I had to learn calculus or engineering or anatomy online, I would struggle. I want to give you as much time as possible. So do well in the first 3 exams. If you're not doing as well, you have time to make it up. That's why I give you the 4th exam to help you fix your grade later. But if you're doing well, push through these last 2 weeks for my course, do a good paper, do a good exam 3, get an A so you can open up that time for other options. If you don't have an A, right, and you're like, oh, I'm at an A minus, I'm going to tell you the way to fix your grade is to take exam 4 and do better and replace a low exam grade. If you missed an exam, right, of course you have to take exam 4 because you're about a 0 on the exam that you missed. Very rarely do I give any other exceptions, right? I have padded this course enough to do this. The only other thing that I will do is I have a few people missing assignments, and they have some good justifications why, and it's very difficult to tell if you're sick because you're not here. So all of these assignment due dates are going to be changed to the end of the semester. Right now, if you're missing an assignment, you can do that assignment. Live stream, people in the classroom, and I'm kind of looking both ways, right? But if you have a missing assignment, there are 5 assignments, I'm going to change their due dates to the end of the semester. I'm going to make sure they're available to you. Do all 5 assignments, get those points, do a paper, get those points. 40% of this grade, you can guarantee yourself, right? Which means you only have to worry about the other 60%, and I dropped the lowest exam. This should be an easy class for you to get an A in. Just dedicate yourself the next 2 weeks to doing better, and most of you should get an A in my class. That's the way it should function, right? I'm very passionate about setting you up for success. All right, so I took a little time to discuss that. I speak very quickly sometimes, and then this mask is not helping. So if I'm not as clear, or if you feel like something I didn't cover, or if you have a personal situation, right? We have had a lot of health issues, a lot of problems when it comes to just the online format, right? I didn't get to go to this format right away because we were concerned about all this like safety issues. We've seen that there's been sort of commentary from people outside the class or people making appropriate commentary. This is a working effort, right? We're working together to make this work in a system that it shouldn't have, right? This was supposed to be an in-class only class. So the fact that it's mixed was not intentional, and the university did not engage in this, right? I found out this when you guys all showed up day 1 that we had to switch because there wasn't a big enough classroom for all of you to be here, right? So if you have an issue that you face because of this, talk to me. I will work with you. It is unfair that you were in this situation paying the high cost of tuition when the resources available to you are very limited. So whenever you run into a problem like that, come talk to me. I can always help you with issues dealing with the classroom. I can't help you with issues after the fact, right? After exam 4, I'm going to submit grades. I don't wait to submit grades. There's no reason to. So once exam 4 is in, there's nothing else left to do except submit grades. It's too late then, right? So as we go into finals, just remember that's the end of the course, right? You can't panic. And then the week after finals, message me and be like, what can I do? I submitted grades at the end of finals week. All right, I submit grades in the finals week. That's the deadline, right? You can't come in later and ask for help. I can't help you because once I submit grades, you have to petition the university for a change of grade. And you have to show why you deserve a change of grade. And then it's no longer a discussion between me and you, it's between you and the university. And the university is much more difficult to deal with than I am, even if I am difficult to deal with, right? Okay, let me make sure. I'm gonna move the camera just a little bit. I hate this setup. All right, so we're on chapter 12 of We the People, right? We're gonna be discussing Congress. A couple of chapters at the end are very dry. So when I'm discussing Congress, I'm going to get to all the details of how Congress works. I don't expect you to remember the names of people, right? Because the people change. And in fact, all of the names of the people that you're concerned with will change, right? If Mitch McConnell does not retain Republican control of the Senate, he won't be majority leader in 3 weeks. They'll be choosing a new majority leader if the Democrats take over. If Nancy Pelosi can't hold on to the House, and even if she does hold in the House and the Democrats, they might vote her out because she didn't meet with the president for a year in the stimulus package. So we don't know if Nancy Pelosi is going to be in her job in a few months, right? So because every job is going to change, I don't need you to know the names. I need you to know the offices, right? I need you to know the committees. Why is it so important that we're talking about this? Let's talk about Congress and get into the slides and we'll talk about this. Let's do some basics and then I'll explain why it's so important to know the offices. All right. So in Congress, we are bicameral. We have a legislative assembly composed of 2 chambers, right? The U.S. House, right? The U.S. House has 435 members. Way in the beginning of the semester, we talked about this. This was that compromise. The House is based on population. California has a lot of representatives. Rhode Island has 1, right? The more population you have, the more representation you have in the House. right? Nevada, since we just went through a census, has a big population growth. We're expected to have more representation in the House in the next decade. So is Arizona, right? Whereas a lot of eastern states are declining in their House representation. So the House has a lot more representation in the West because there's a lot more population in the West, a lot more population growth in the West. The Senate always has 2 members per state, which means that Rhode Island has 2, California has 2, Nevada has 2, New York has 2. They all have 2 senators. What this creates is a little bit of an unevenness, right? Rhode Island has essentially three people in the legislative branch, right? Which means that their number of people per elected official is lower, right? Theirs is like 35,000 people for an elected official, right? And California is like 75,000 for an elected official, right? Because of those 2 senators off balancing the aspects. But this is intentional, right? Remember, this was part of the Great Compromise. You have equal representation in the Senate and you have representation based on population in the House. Is intentional. The next term is constituency, right? Your constituency is very different. And in theory, right, why is Biden talking about being the president for everyone, right? Because the mandate of the president is to represent the country. The mandate of the official in your district does not have to represent the country. And in fact, the idea behind having different constituencies is that your responsibility is to the people in your district, even at the consequence of the country, right? Right now, the US still makes M1A1 Abrams tanks, and it's made in a specific district. And the military has said they don't need any more tanks, right? The federal government doesn't want to pay for many tanks. Most places in the country don't understand why there's so many tanks, but there's one district in which all of those tanks are made, which means all of those jobs are coming from one district. So the people who are elected to that office, they always say, my primary responsibility is to make sure this military factory stays open, right? And they're very successful at that. So even though it costs the American taxpayer money to continue making these tanks we don't need, they're solving a problem for their district, which is how do we keep these people employed, right? And that is their primary responsibility, right? Whoever we decide to elect in Nevada, they represent Southern Nevada. And the needs of Southern Nevada are dramatically different than the needs of the rest of the country. We need more access to water. We need better ways to get fresh water into this community because there's no water coming in, but there's a lot of water usage, right? So we have different needs in other places. And that's the most obvious example, right? If you lived in Colorado, you're like, why is Nevada spending so much on irrigation systems? Why are they spending so much to make sure there's water conservation or reservoirs? Because it's necessary in this district, it is not necessary in other districts, right? Southern Nevada is very diverse. We need more diversity training in Southern Nevada for local officials than we need in Northern Nevada, which is more homogenous. The district and your constituency decide what your needs are. And your constituency will tell you, the residents in the area, right, who lives in that area will tell you what they need. And your job, right, the argument is that your job in Congress is to respond to their need. Okay. To be in the House, you only have to be 25. To be in the Senate, you only have to be 30 years old, right? U.S. citizenship, you have to be a citizen for 7 years to be in the House, right? So you have to turn 18, be a citizen when you turn 18, and then by 25, you are capable of serving in the House. And the Senate, at least 9 years of being a U.S. citizen. Typically, people are significantly older, right? It takes time to generate the popular support necessary to get elected. And this, you're gonna have to check that every once in a while. So the big difference is that the length of term. In the House, it's 2 years. Everyone's serving a 2-year term, which means that every 2 years, everyone in the House gets reelected. And so their behavior reflects that, right? People who are representatives in the House are always in an election cycle. They get elected, they have a few months, and then they go back into the election cycle. Right? House representatives are always in the election cycle, and they're expected to be responsive to the public. Right? This is not accidental. This is by design. We want them to be constantly responsive to the public. And so the House is the place where the legislative branch responds to every public cry. Right? Whenever the public wants something, whenever your constituent wants something, if you're a representative, you respond. A senator serves 6 years. and it's a statewide office. And part of this is that as a statewide office, you're not just looking at local communities. You have to look at what's for the state, right? So a Nevada senator, right, has to behave differently than a representative because they have to worry about the Southern Nevada, which has very different needs than Northern Nevada as a statewide office. The other part is 6 years, and we'll talk about this a lot. Being in office for 6 years between elections means that you can make better decisions based on scientific fact or policy or party principle or the platform or whatever it is that's driving you, that don't have to be as responsive to the public, right? We talked about the difference between a trustee and a delegate. The House of Representatives is typically a delegate. They do what the public wants. A senator is a trustee. A senator is expected to be calm and cool and thoughtful and reflective. And as senator, think about the things that are best for their state. Remember, your constituency is still your state and not the country. Mitch McConnell's job, part of his job, is to put Kentucky first. In the same way that we would expect senators in Nevada to put Nevada first. That's their part of the role. The other part is to think about the consequences of decisions, right? The Senate is supposed to be expected to think about the consequences more and maybe consider whether or not the public is best served by what they want. Right? If the public demands something, senators have to take into account, is the public really best served by what they demanded? Right? Remember, we're not a direct democracy in the federal government. We're a representative democracy. And a representative democracy includes that trustee aspect, is where your elected officials are expected to do what's in your best interest, regardless of what you ask for. So I jumped a little ahead, but in this next slide, we have trustees, delegates, right? A delegate votes according to the preferences of their constituency. The preferences of the constituency dictate the behavior of a delegate. A trustee, right, what do they think is best for their constituency? Now, I always use the example, I am a graduate student right here, and I had another graduate student who was in, I think they were a chemical engineer or they were in water management services, and they talked about how the public isn't very informed about recycled water, and the public doesn't really get a vote in recycled water. And my response would be to him, as it is to you, right, is should the public really be deciding whether or not we use recycled water and whether or not what the standards are for recycled water, right? Because we know that there are health and safety standards for your water, but most of you don't want to engage in recycled water. You don't want water that's been used, right, by other people, right? And that's the whole point, is no one wants that. And if we voted on it, we would say, no, we don't want that. But without recycled water, we couldn't have enough water for the population that we have in Southern Nevada, right? It's a logistics problem. So trustees help solve that logistics problem, right? Typically, trustees do things that the public don't really like, but are necessary for the public to survive, right? Seatbelt laws did not exist until the late 20th century, right? So you had decades of cars existing, right? 1910s, 1920s, you started with the car, and then you start to get faster speeds, and then you start to have highways, and then in the 50s and 60s, it becomes very clear that seatbelts would save lives. That if you put seatbelts in, they would save lives. And so for a time, very few car manufacturers added seatbelts. It wasn't cool, it didn't fit with the design, or whatever it was. And then eventually, as the car manufacturers come together, and then there's a person named Ralph Nader who has a document called Unsafe at Any Speed, makes it clear that you could prevent thousands of deaths, right, if you just mandate seatbelts, right? And today, we have mandated seatbelts. And we have ticketing for not wearing your seatbelt. And whole campaigns, right? California has a campaign, I believe it's in Nevada, that's called Click It or Ticket, where they just try and encourage people to wear their seatbelt and ticket them for them, right? That's a trustee. You don't like it, but it's going to help save your life, right? Behaviors like that are trustee. And obviously, you can go wrong with this, right? There are clear historical examples where trustees do the wrong thing, right? We know historically that the Native American community, right, had been sterilized against their will because the public thought that they should not reproduce, right? So the trustee is very problematic, but it's also something that is a role that is trying to be filled by someone who's in a high office, right? What's best for the nation? And you can make mistakes, right? Obviously, you can make mistakes, right? When do you want a trustee and when you want a delegate? That's sort of a harder question. The next part is sociological representation, and sociological representation is kind of like identity representation. If you are a minority, you may want someone who looks like you to represent you. And we talked about that some of this is that you just might feel more comfortable having someone who looks like you or who behaves like you, right, or has the same religion as you representing you, right? That some of that might be just that you want someone like you to represent you. The other part is that I talked about Charles Mills already in the semester, right? Charles Mills has that book, Blackness Visible, right? That it might be impossible for some people to know the perspective of other people, right? Specifically, Charles Mills is talking about being a black male in America, right? That I, as a white male, will never know what it's like to have someone follow me around the store. I typically won't know what it's like to have strangers cross the street when they see me, right? There are certain behaviors that are unique to certain groups, right? The other occasions as well. Charles Mills is the most obvious example. His book's fairly popular as a text in political science, right? But Jan Tinkner writes the same thing, right? Women have a very different response when they're out at night than males do, right? All of these perspectives mean that your interaction with society is going to be different, and sociological representation has a theoretical basis. Why do you want someone to look like you? There's also just a normal social basis. You probably feel more comfortable having this representation, some representation that looks like you, right? Right now, we're in the middle of a Representation Matters movement, right? There's an entire Representation Matters collection and a lot of these streaming services, right? There's a recognition that we want to see ourselves in these avenues, right? That we want to see ourselves in these offices. The other part is agency representation. And this talks about when you punish or reward someone for representing, right? We'll talk about this in a second. I think it's in the next slide. Let me just make sure. No. Okay. So agency representation is where the voters, either preemptively or retrospectively vote based on the performance. And Dean Heller is a perfect example. He was a senator for the state of Nevada. He said that he supported the Affordable Care Act, and then he voted against it. And he sort of aligned with Trump in 2016 and 2017 dealing with the Affordable Care Act. And in 2018, he was replaced with a Democratic senator. He was punished by his constituency. His constituency in Nevada said they wanted the ACA. He voted against it and before the election in 2018, and he was punished by it. So agency representation is where what you do changes the outcome of whether or not you stay in office or win office. So representatives are real people, right? We have to understand that these are real people. And the first part is that they want to do the best job that they can in order to stay in office, in part. And so in part, what they do first is they try and discover the interests of your constituency. And this is actually incredibly difficult because what I need to find is the things that are important enough to the people in my elected area, right, in my district or my state, what's important enough for them to become politically involved, for them to care, right? When I talk about recycled water, most of you just don't care. It's not a big issue because we don't concern ourselves with it, right? There are a lot of issues that we don't concern ourselves with as Nevadans that are important elsewhere, right? And to be clear, recycled water is one of those very technical issues that is mostly left to sort of committees and technical services and people with advanced degrees. But there are some things that certain constituents don't care about. If you were in Arizona, immigration would be a bigger issue. It's still a fairly big issue here, but not nearly as big as Arizona or Southern California, right? If you're from Wisconsin, immigration is not actually that big of an issue in your constituency, right? Rhetorically, nationally it might, but in your community, in your local elections, immigration is not the issue it is in the Southwest, right? There's not a concern because how many immigrants are ending up in Wisconsin or Minnesota, right? Just not as many. Once you know the interests of your constituency, then you have to look at the diversity of your constituency and how valuable those things are, right? If 51% of your community really cares about something and really wants that thing, right? Like whatever it is, like marijuana legalization in the state of Nevada, but 49% hate it, right? What percentage of those people will vote, right? So that's also part of it. What do the constituency care about, and what will they actually get out and vote for, right? Because there are a lot of issues that Nevadans care about that they won't vote for, right? Taxation is not an issue in Nevada that you can get voters to engage in, regardless of what it is, because we don't pay state income tax, right? We have mandates on low sales taxes, right? There are things that we just don't impact us. So Nevadans are not income tax-based voters. That's not an issue that matters to them as much. And then once you're in office, how do I work within those interests to make governance and policy that allows me to stay in office, but also if my goal is twofold, what allows me to stay in office? And then the other part, what actually benefits my constituents, right? My constituents want something. How do I benefit them and stay in office? And sometimes those goals do not align. Sometimes staying in office does not come in the same direction as getting what your constituents need, right? If your constituents really, really need something and it's going to cost you electorally, then sometimes you have to decide between the two. So this is where it comes in this book by David Mayhew. It's called Congress. The name of the book is called Congress, but it's Congress, the Electoral Connection. And Mayhew explains in 1974, right, that the people that run for Congress are not normal people. They're not the normal types of people. These are incredibly ambitious people, right? Very, very ambitious people, and they are very good at fundraising, right? People who win the office are very good at getting other people to give them money, which means that the personality of an official who's trying to get elected, right? Someone who's trying to be represented in Congress is more akin to a salesperson than to an academic. Right? I would be very, very bad at trying to run from office, right? I always try to make a nuanced approach. I try to keep things balanced, things you cannot do. I'm also a terrible salesman, which I know from personal experience, but the roles are not comparative, right? Very rarely do you get someone that has an academic approach to life with someone who's an electoral candidate, right? It's very rare, right? In fact, that's why when you hear, most of you are young enough that this did not happen in your adult life, but when you hear Obama speak, why is his speech pattern so different? Is because he's considering the academics of it. Right? If you go back and watch his videos, right, he's very careful in his discussion, and there's a lot of seemingly pauses that shouldn't be there. It's because he's choosing every single word, right? He was also a constitutional law professor, and so sometimes getting a clear answer from him would be more difficult because he's talking about all of these other things. In the same way that I do, I'm sure that is upsetting to all of you, right? There are all of these factors that are in our brains that we want to include, where someone who's just running for office, they want a clear answer, right? Biden did a fantastic thing that is a terrible electoral behavior. You know, Trump was asking him why he couldn't get more passage, and he just said Republican Congress, right? He was just saying that they had a Republican Congress and a divided government, right? But you have to explain more than that, right? He went too far on the other side in that case, right? I'm not supporting either candidate. I'm explaining an actual moment, right, where he made a comment and it wasn't clear what he was saying because he was just trying to sell a point and he wasn't trying to inform academically. And elected officials usually are on the side of less information, more influence, right? And when you're too far on the other side of explanation, it hurts you because you allow the other side opinions. So those types of people, the people that involve themselves in Congress, they're ambitious, right? They're trying to give you quick answers that are a little more one-sided, right? The other part is that in every election, there's an incumbency. There are people that are already in office. And 90% of the time, people in office get reelected. 90% of people that are in office will get reelected. Mitch McConnell's staying where he's at, right? There are very rare cases that switch over. So only 10% turnover on incumbents. We're expecting a lot of turnover. So we're expecting this to violate from our expectations a little bit in this election, but we're also expecting a lot more voters. Early voting has already significantly surpassed previous early voting. And we believe that Republican voters are being told to wait till election day or encouraged to wait till election day. So we kind of expect that there'll be a lot more voters on election day and a lot more early voting because early voting lasts until the 30th. So we're expecting a lot more voters. So it should change a little bit in this term. The last part, right, is this idea of term limits. Term limits are these legal limits on how many terms an elected official can serve. So one of the things is that in Congress, there are no term limits. There are no term limits in Congress. The federal government only has one office that has term limits, and that's the president. The president is the only one who cannot stay in office continuously. The president is limited to 2 terms, right? 2 terms. Now, until FDR, it was a tradition that they only served 2 terms. George Washington, in serving a 2nd term, was very concerned about a new monarchy. And he said, I will run for a 2nd term, but I will not run for a 3rd. This has to be my last term. And he set a standard, right? Washington sets all these precedents for us. And the standard lasts until FDR. And FDR said, well, there's no rule against me running again. And then the country passed an amendment after FDR saying that you can only run for 2 terms, right, as president. Lifetime, right? Doesn't matter how long it is, 2 terms in your lifetime. Otherwise, there are no term limits in Congress. So we've talked about this other aspect. So now we know who's running. How do we decide how many seats there are? We've talked about this a number of times. I am definitely going to ask you a question about this, right? That you should expect to know gerrymandering and redistricting. We just went through a census. In fact, it's sort of wrapping up, but we just went through a census. We're going to use that information to decide the apportionment. So how many seats does everyone get? And this is based on relative population growth. Nevada, Arizona, California are growing very rapidly. The populations are growing rapidly. The demographics are changing as well, but we're not as worried about that just yet. The big part is that their population is growing rapidly, and the populations of the northeastern states are shrinking. Rhode Island had a lower population, right? So that relative difference, that difference means that more representatives are going to fewer and fewer states, right? As Nevada and Arizona and the West Coast and New York get more representation in the House, that means less of that representation is coming from those smaller states. And so apportionment is just how you decide how many districts and how many seats are in each state, right? And we should expect, California's already got so many that it's hard to give them more, but we should expect Nevada and Arizona to get, I think Nevada might get 1 and Arizona might get 1, so a slight growth in that period. But they're only 435, right? It's locked at 435. So those have to come from somewhere in the apportionment. When you reapportion, right, we have let's say 4 districts. If we go to 6 districts, then we have to redraw those districts. And one of the things about redistricting is that all 6 districts that we redraw have to have the same population, right? The relative, right, within some sort of margin of error. They all have to share a percentage of the population. So if we have 6 districts, 16% of the population has to be in each district, right? That's the breakdown. So now we're drawing the districts. The people in the state house, so whoever gets elected to the state house, the state government, is going to draw that map. And when they're drawing the map next year, the way they're going to draw the map is going to be to benefit the party in power as much as is constitutionally allowed, right? There are a lot of rules about this. That is gerrymandering, right? How do I draw the districts in such a way that I get a maximum number of seats with the least amount of votes, right? How do I break it out? And so if we always have an example, right? If you have 60% of the vote, right, and there are 5 seats, you would expect to get 3, right? 20% of the vote gets a seat, right? So you get 3 and the opposition gets 2, right? But if you re-break those districts where every single district is 60-40, right, then instead of getting 3 of the 5 seats, you can get all 5 by redrawing the districts. And there are a lot of weird looking districts that, because of the way they are drawn, are very problematic, right? Then that goes through a constitutional review process. Because there was so much gerrymandering in previous administrations after redistricting, California, Arizona, New Jersey, and a whole host of other states have gone to what are called independent commissions. The independent commissions try to find a way to create as many competitive districts as possible. How do I evenly distribute these districts without drawing district lines that don't make any sense, right? Instead of having, and I'm going to go to the screen so I can show you, some districts are very linear, right? They're drawn out this way, right? But this doesn't make any sense because if you live over here, you may not have as much in common as someone that lives over here. And so what you want is you want a district that is as circular or as much a square as possible. Because what this does is if you have your representative here, it limits the distance of any one citizen closest to their representative. But it also homogenizes their interests. Not sociologically, right? They might be very diverse, but it homogenizes their interests in location. If you live in Las Vegas, your interests are very different than the interests of Carson City, right? Your interests are very different than people out in Pahrump or whatever's in the Northeast, right? If you live in another state, right? Los Angeles and San Francisco, very, very different interests. And so when you have those districts, right, an independent commission tries to make it to where they're as compact as possible, right? And as straight of lines as possible to make it very clear that that district, right, has shared interests, right? I come from a place that's agricultural, right? Where I grew up, there's a lot of agriculture. Right next to that place is a big industrial port, right? A deep channel going into California. So we have very, very different values. You would want to split us up based on those different values, right? Hopefully that creates more representation. But independent commissions have not been perfect. There's no such thing as a completely unbiased individual. I'm biased, we're biased, right? We all have our biases, right? Trying to minimize them is the best that we can do. Okay. The next aspect is this idea of patronage. But patronage is an idea that when you win a higher office, you have particular resources available to you, and then you use those resources and you give them to partisans who have given you support. So we already talked about this actually. If you were to campaign for Biden and you were to raise a lot of money for that candidate, right, for that campaign, or if you were to campaign for Trump and raise a lot of money, and one of them wins, right, then it is likely that you will be offered some position, right? Why is it that Kamala Harris is the VP candidate to Biden rather than someone else, right? Rather than, right, we knew because of his background that, right, he had to, it was necessary, it was expected that he would pick a Black female like Kamala Harris because she had all these resources, right? She had all this campaign funding, she had all this support that she had done very well in the primaries, right? They brought them in because that person brought a lot of support to the campaign, right? Not complete patronage, but definitely, right, a version of patronage that we would discuss. The most obvious is whoever wins is going to appoint some people to offices based on their contributions rather than their qualifications, right? The ambassador to Costa Rica is very rarely someone who's an expert in international relations, right? Usually that's a rewarded office and some form of patronage. There's no difference between parties or elected candidates and patronage, right? Patronage is sort of universal. It's not corrupt either, right? You want people to support you. And we talked about Schatzsnyder before, right? Excuse me, not Schatzsnyder, Olson, right? That there's a collective action problem. No one wants to help you get elected if they're not going to get something in exchange. So patronage helps solve that collective action through selective incentives, right? You can get something in addition to your candidate winning if you support them well enough, right? You can get some sort of office or some sort of perk. The next part is pork barrel. So patronage is when some opportunity goes to a specific person, right, in exchange for their support of getting them elected. Pork is where you find money that goes to something in your district which isn't necessary. Now, part of this about pork spending or pork barrel spending is that it used to happen a lot. And whenever you wanted a new bridge or a new dam, all of that wasn't covered in the bill, you could exchange your vote for some pork spending. You could say, hey, I want a new solar array in my area, right? Because we need more energy. We don't, it's not completely needed, but it would help my citizens with their energy bills, right? And so you say, I will vote for this transportation bill if you put some pork into it for me, right? And obviously the language is a little more couched, right? You don't come out and say that, right? But usually there's an offer involved where you get some sort of pork project in exchange for voting in support of that bill. This happened a lot, and one of the concerns was that this needed to be ended, right? So Congress passed a bill that made it difficult, if not impossible, for any pork spending. This happened about 15, 20 years ago. Immediately after that, what you saw is there was no way for individual districts to find funding for infrastructure projects, right? You could not get any more pork, which means that if your highway needed to be fixed or you needed an underpass restructured, you couldn't use that money, that pork, to fix those things. And so even though we don't have pork spending today, what we have found without it, there are a lot of things that just don't get done, right? The public doesn't want to pay for infrastructure, right? No one wants to pay for a highway, but highways are necessary. And so pork helps solve that problem, that trustee problem, right? I need something that the public doesn't say they care about, but if a bridge collapses, I'm definitely gonna lose my job, right? So pork used to solve that problem and now it doesn't. That's why the infrastructure in the United States is so bad. We passed a law trying to prevent pork spending, and the outcome was that we had much worse infrastructure than we did before that, right? And it made it very clear that pork helps keep our infrastructure running. The next part is a private bill. A private bill deals with very small groups of the population or a single person, right? Some private bills that reflect a specific person are rare, but often a private bill will deal with only certain parts of the population, right? A private bill is why Cubans are treated differently when they immigrate to the United States, right? Sometimes we talk about this wet foot, dry foot policy, right? If you come by boat, right, or if you come over water, then it's much easier to become a citizen of the United States or to find asylum than if you come by foot, right? And they're both, right? There are all these other conditions, but for the most part, the laws have made it so that people coming from the East Coast by water, right, have an easier path to become asylum seekers or to gain citizenship than people coming from Central and South America, right? That those are different behaviors. So that's a private bill. The most obvious example of a private bill is veterans benefits because it only applies to that group of people, right? That's the most obvious example. And it's the most common, right? There are a lot of veterans bills, right? A lot of veterans bills, right? All veterans now get some sort of college support if they served, right? All veterans get housing support, right? If you are a veteran and you want to buy a house, you get more guarantees, right? There are just more available to veterans that targets a specific population, and that makes it a private bill. And there's no concern about private bills. Usually the arguments are so strong that, right? It used to be that there was this argument that one party served veterans better, but both parties serve veterans the best they possibly can because there's no public outcry against it, right? That everyone wants more services for veterans. We have all these problems, right? Veterans are coming back with all these issues that aren't being serviced, right? Everyone can agree that they need them. So there's very little pushback in Congress against those type of private bills. All right. So in Congress, you will have a conference caucus, right? So every 2 years, right, you have a conference that is deciding the leadership, right? The other thing you have is a political caucus, and this is usually informal, right? It's some sort of group in which they align on specific issues, right? You have the House Freedom Caucus, that's all the people that come from sort of the 2016 movement, right? They're very limited government, right? They want to sort of revert back to previous eras of time, right? You have the Black Caucus, right? That is specifically a sociological representation, right? You have the Women's Caucus, right? That typically deals with women's issues, right? Or what they think should be the most prominent issues, right? Even, I hate this term, it's a very popular term, it's AOC +3, right? Even that group, right, is a sort of caucus, right? It's a young, right? It's not a named caucus, but it's a grouping of people with like-minded policies that come together. I will never ask you a question that involves the word caucus, right? I think the term is overly defined. It means too many things, right? If it can be political or voting or just issue-oriented, it's the term itself. So if you see a question and that word comes up, if the word caucus comes up, that is not the right answer. I'm telling you right now. And I probably shouldn't come up in my exams at all. I don't like how the word is used for different meanings. I like well-defined terms. It doesn't work that way. When they do elect leaders in Congress, they elect on partisan lines. So why is the Speaker of the House a Democrat right now? Because the Democrats have more representation in the House, right? Partisan lines. You always vote for your party when it comes to leadership. Now, among the competition in the party is very different, right? Mitch McConnell is the majority leader in the Senate. Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker of the House. But the Speaker of the House and the majority leader have power, right? And they argue about this, right? Why Nancy Pelosi is not very popular among the Democrats, right? She's an old school Democrat. She has different values. She doesn't have the youth or the energy of some of these other people. Why is it Nancy Pelosi? Because she was in a position to say she could do the job, right? But it's an elected position. She was the one who won out in that vote because she fits the role better than anyone else. Not because she's the most popular, but she believes she can be the most effective. And we're going to see if the Democrats keep the House, if Nancy Pelosi still stays Speaker of the House after this election. So speaking of these offices, let's talk about this, right? Speaker of the House. The Speaker of the House is the most important person in the House, right? They set the legislative agenda, right? They decide in which order those are considered, right? They can set the agenda. And they put in people in their positions, right? So if you want to be chair of an Armed Services Committee, or if you want to be chair of Ways and Means, which we'll discuss in a second, that has to come through the Speaker. The Speaker decides if you go into that position. And because the chair of the Ways and Means Committee decides all revenue bills, if you want to talk about tax law or any sort of type of expenditure, any type of thing that allows people to get a tax break or increase costs to individuals, it has to go through that Ways and Means Committee. So being chair of that committee is incredibly powerful, which means the person who appoints them is very powerful, and that's the Speaker of the House, right? The Speaker of the House, most of that power comes from setting the agenda, right? Deciding in which order things are considered, right? And choosing who are the chairs of the committee. So before I move on too much, right, because I know you've got a lot that you're looking at right now, why is agenda setting so powerful? If I say we have 10 things that we have to discuss, and I'm going to decide the order in which we discuss those 10 times, what most of you will recognize right away is by the time we get to the 10th thing, either there won't be time, we'll run out of time, or we just simply won't discuss it, or people will have run out of energy and they won't be as engaged. You want to be the first on the list of things that are covered, right? If I say we're going to have, right, a certain amount of speakers, right, and we're gonna discuss like each of them, right? That first speaker is gonna have more energy than the second speaker, and we're normally gonna fatigue. The bigger part in Congress, because they have a lot more time to deal with this, is that even though you have more time, if I put your bill 23rd, 50th on the list, we'll never get to it. And it will effectively die because we will never discuss it, right? Agenda setting power is very important, and the Speaker of the House has that, and the committee, and the assignments of committees. The majority leader is the elected leader of the majority party. That's a typo, in the House of Representatives or in the Senate. In the House of Representatives, the Speaker of the House and the majority leader, the Speaker of the House has more power. In the Senate, there is no speaker, right? The Speaker of the Senate is the Vice President. And we know the Speaker of the Senate, the Vice President only has a couple of roles. They can vote in a tie-breaking case, right? And some procedural aspects. But they don't choose assignments in the Senate, right? So the most powerful person in the Senate is the majority leader, right? And the state of Nevada is the same as the federal government. So if I ask you a question about the state of Nevada, if I ask you a question about the federal government, it's the Speaker of the House, right, is the most powerful in the House, and the majority leader is the most powerful in the Senate. Now, because you have a majority leader, you have to have a minority leader, right? A minority leader, right? And so the same thing, right? The party with the most representatives or the most senators, they choose a majority leader, right, based on political lines, and then the party with the least amount, right, with the lower number of elected officials, they choose a minority leader. Now, the minority leader also chooses assignments, but they don't have as many choices because they're not the majority party, and they don't choose the chairs, and the chairs themselves have a lot of power. The last office is what's called a whip. And there was a show, and unfortunately, like the person involved in it turned out to be a horrific human being. But a whip used to be very easy to describe. Their job primarily is to go and figure out who has what votes, right? The whip's job is to go and find out who's going to vote what way. So you take a bill, whatever the bill is, and you go find all, right now it's a Democratic House. Let's just do a Republican Senate, right? So let's say you're the majority whip and you work for the Republican Party, right? You're a Republican senator, you're elected to be a whip, so you serve the majority leader, but your job is to go to every other Republican and find out whether or not they support it. So right now, why do we know that Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski are not going to go out for certain bills? Because the whip went to them and figured out their vote, right? They also said very publicly, right? The whip has an incredibly powerful job because when they fail, it always makes the news. One of the things that we don't really discuss as much about Congress is the Congress knows the outcome of the vote before it happens, right? In elections, we don't know. We don't know the outcome of elections yet, right? And on election day, there will be all this counting and figuring it out. In Congress, you count the votes first and then you vote, right? You make sure you're going to get, excuse me, it's not very, okay, just dry. When you're a whip, one of the aspects is that you've already figured out how all the votes are counted, right? That's why if you look historically, why is John McCain's no vote such a big deal, right? Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins also voted no to the skinny bill, right? So at some point, maybe 2 years ago, the skinny bill was this bill that basically removed the Affordable Care Act without a medical replacement. Now, without it, we would be in a lot more trouble, right? There are 20 million Americans going through this that wouldn't have COVID protections, wouldn't have other protections without the Affordable Care Act. So you go to this vote, and it was expected to be 50 votes, and then the vice president was going to come in and be the tiebreaker. And John McCain walks up, he puts his hand up, he votes no, he was expected to vote yes. The fact that he was expected to vote yes is the important part, right? His contribution isn't more than Murkowski's or Collins, it's that it was a surprise. And because it was a surprise, the whip had failed to do their job, and it didn't allow them to plan, and therefore it failed, right? The bill failed. And there was a lot of scrambling, but the bill ended up failing. So a whip's job is very important because without the count of the vote, you can get very surprising outcomes. And the Senate and the House of Representatives, they don't want surprising outcomes, right? And if you have 52, 53 senators, any defection can cause a bill to fail. So it's a very thin margin. The whip's job is very important. Okay. So the reason that I said, right, the reason I argued that the Speaker of the House in the Assembly and the House, right, and the majority leader in the Senate are so important was that they chose the chairs and the majority and the seats of the committees. So why is it so important that they choose the chairs of committees? Is because we are a committee system, right? We're a committee system. So any issue that wants to be discussed, any issue that wants to be covered, whether it's COVID-19 or unemployment or police reform, any issue has to start in committee. And there are a couple of different types of committees. The standing committees are the permanent committees, right? A permanent committee. And they cover a specific subject, right? You have the Armed Services Committee, you have the Finance Committee, the Agricultural Committee, the Ways and Means Committee in the House of Representatives, right? All of these committees cover that subject, which means if you're not on that committee, you can't be involved in that discussion, right? No matter what, right? No matter what certain people say, if they're not on that committee, they're not involved in the formation of a bill dealing with that issue, right? If you're not on the Armed Service Committee, you're not really dealing with going to war or how funds are distributed to the military. Only the people in that committee are, right? So if you want name recognition, you need to be on some of these big committees, Armed Services, Ways and Means, right? There are specific committees that give you more options, right, to behave and to influence policy, right? Why was it so important when Senator Inhofe was put on the climate change committee, the environmental services committee, because he doesn't believe in climate services, and he is the person influencing how Congress deals with that, right? He's the person who brought a snowball into the Senate room and said, how can you say that climate change is occurring? Here's a snowball, right? He later said that climate change can happen because God wouldn't allow it, right? And I'm not picking on him. I'm just saying that he's on the environmental services committee. And if he's the one deciding whether or not it's considered, then other people don't really have a say if he's the chair, right? If he's the chair of that committee, right? How can other people have a say when he decides what bills even get considered, right? There are also select committees. These are typically temporary. These deal with specific issues, right? The committee to appoint the new justice, the new Supreme Court justice, that was a temporary committee, but there's also a judicial committee that deals with a lot of that. The Select Committee on Benghazi was a temporary committee to try and get answers from then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton about the handling of that attack, right? So those are select committees, right? They're temporary. They're usually more about investigation, right? We all knew before the Senate hearing on Justice Barrett, right, on Supreme Court Justice Barrett, that how the Republicans wrote. They chose that person, they were going to vote them in. So the questions were about finding out about that person or trying to make sure they had clear answers about everything, right? How are you impacted? Are you going to vote? How are you going to vote, right? And she has said that she's an originalist, right? She interprets the Constitution as it was originally written. She doesn't try to put it in a modern context, right? Which means she's going to behave much more like Justice Scalia, who was deeply conservative, right? Than the seat she's replacing, the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right? Both Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, right? But their behavior would be different, right? And she was answering questions, explaining how she would align, how it would align much more with Scalia, right? So it's about investigation. A joint committee is formed whenever you have a bill, because the way that a bill passes the House, if it doesn't match the way that it passes the Senate, then a joint committee helps find a way to make sure that it will continually pass both, right? And a joint committee comes together and says, this is what I need for the House to support this bill, right? If it's modified in the Senate, and the Senate does the same. So a joint committee, all it does is take the House version and the Senate version and find a unified version that works for both. And that's a little more complicated, but joint committees aren't as popular because usually by that mistake, there's very minor points that are being discussed. The last is a conference committee. Okay, never mind. Yeah, joint committees are all things that are made from the House and Senate. A conference committee is trying to work them together. I apologize, right? That I had them out of order, right? The conference committee is trying to make one version of two different pieces of legislation. Joint committee is any committee that has House and Senate members on it. Because you can also have representatives, you can have people on committees from both the House and Senate for like investigative reasons. And there are very, very few committees that are joint committees. Armed services at times a joint committee. So, right, you have these committees. We talked about standing. We talked about why it's so important to be on a specific committee. So how do you organize and how do you get some of these positions? So it's not just about loyalty, right? One of the things about being on certain committees that used to apply that doesn't apply as much is this idea of seniority, right? And the way that seniority works is that if you have been on a committee the longest, usually you get the chair of that committee, right? Why is it that Senator Inhofe, when he joins the committee, when he becomes the chair, is because he's been in the Senate a long time, right? I'm not want to peg on him. He's just served a long period of time. And so when you have people like Dianne Feinstein and Inhofe and Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell, right? These senators have been in office a long time. Nancy Pelosi as well, right? Because they've been in office so long, when they are on a committee, they're typically a senior member, and that allows them to be chairs of more committees, right? But their party has to win that branch of government, right? It has to be a Republican-controlled Senate for Mitch McConnell to assign chairs. It has to be a Democratic House for Speaker Pelosi to assign chairs, right? So the parties still matter, but seniority is second. Seniority doesn't always matter, but there are some aspects. The only other part is that committee chairs are limited to 3 terms. Senators are in place for a long, long time. Senators very rarely win the presidential election. Right? Senators don't do that well in presidential elections, but they're in states, right? And so states are very consistently go for one party. Kentucky is a Republican state, right? A senator from Kentucky is much more likely to be a Republican than a Democrat, right? Republican controlled senator, right, in the Democratic, in Kentucky, right? Kentucky will typically have a Republican senator. California is going to have 2 Democratic senators, right? It's very consistent. And once it becomes very consistent, right, what happens next is they stay in positions for a very long period of time. And as you gain seniority, you're the chair over and over and over again. And one of the things that the American people have argued that they want is turnover. We want changes in who is governing. Even if things are going well, we still want turnover. We don't want one person forever to run any aspect. So we want those to shift. So committee chairs have to shift every 3 terms. But if you're a senator, it means you can be chair of a committee for 18 years. As long as your party stays in power, you can be a chair for 18 years. It's a very long period of time. We have some staff agencies, which we won't get into too much. We talk about the bureaucracy later, but there is a legislative support agency. So whenever a congressperson wants to write a bill, remember most of them don't have the expertise to do that without support, right? You need legal support to say, okay, this is what you want the bill to do. Here's the exact language to do it. Because often the way you write a bill won't fit with what you want to happen, right? Sometimes terminology means something very specific in congressional law, right? Constitutional law is very complex, right? Trying to write a bill that changes the government has a lot of complexity, and without looking at the very specific language can be very problematic. We talked about caucuses in congressional caucuses, the Steel Caucus, the travel and tourism. So Nevada has a concern about the travel and tourism, right? Tourism, the senators and representatives from Nevada are always concerned about whether or not states can come here, right? There was a discussion, right, because California wanted to ban all travel in and out of the state, right? And there was a discussion that Nevada never wanted to close its state borders because it relied so much on tourism. And so in Congress, it really fought against state travel bans, right? It really fought against it because we rely on tourism for the success of our economy, right? If you're part of the Steel Caucus, right, your concerns are very different. So each caucus is based on a specific interest, and then there are some sort of minority caucuses, but the Congressional Black Caucus is one of the oldest caucuses, and it was very clear, right? Remember, there's segregation, right? Slavery is history, right? That you had to represent those interests sociologically. Okay, so I keep telling you that committees are important. I keep giving you this aspect. So let's just go through it, each step about how these things happen. And there's a lot of detail here. One of the things is that the way in which a bill becomes a law is different than maybe we expect. So the simple version is that someone proposes a bill, it goes to a vote, and if they vote for it, right, then it goes to the next step and the president either vetoes or signs it. What actually happens is that in a committee, right, the committee has those issues. So if the issue is climate change, right, only that committee can deal with it. And then in that committee, a bill is introduced, and it can be introduced by, right, a lobbyist with a co-signed by the representative or the senator, or it can be introduced by the individual, right? And then it goes through what's called a committee markup. So in the committee, what can happen is you introduce a bill on climate change. And if you're in today's Senate, right, it's Republican controlled. So a Democratic senator introduces a climate change bill. When they introduce the climate change bill, it goes through a markup. And in that markup, the Republicans, right, because they're the majority right now in the Senate, they cross out, they rewrite, and they quite literally write all over this thing, right? In the same way that if you did a collaborative process where you had written out a typed up piece of paper on a proposal, and then everyone just took a pen and started writing on it. Here's something I don't like, I want to change this, I want to change this. And they start making all these modifications, And then by the time that it gets through that markup, you may not even want, but if you're a Democratic senator, you may not want that bill anymore. And so you always have the right to remove that bill. And so first, if you're not the majority party in that committee, it's difficult to get a bill out that helps you. The other part is the chair has final say in what things go from markup to debate, right? There is no requirement of the chair to consider every bill that's proposed. So if you propose a bill that the chair doesn't want to deal with, it just doesn't get dealt with, right? That's a non-democratic process, right? They are the chair, they tell you whether or not your bill is going to be considered. And so because chairs are assigned, right, strategically, there might be someone who's a little more moderate, right, that doesn't allow the House Freedom Caucus, which is more conservative, right, or these new Green Party liberals on the left, right? They're not getting policy through because of these chairs. These chairs are acting as gateways, right? They're not allowing anything through. Sometimes I talk about them as being veto players. They're not allowing them. So then, let's say you get a bill, it gets marked up, you decide that you actually can agree on enough that it can come out of committee, right? So you get this bill together, you write it up. Before it goes to a vote, it goes to what's usually called the Rules Committee, right? Depending on the House or the Senate. And the Rules Committee decides whether or not they will be debate, right? So this is a closed versus open rule aspect of it, right? A closed rule in the House means that there aren't a lot of time for debate and you can't introduce amendments, changes, right? Remember, we're talking about a bill. We mean any change is called an amendment, right? Only in this case is an amendment refer to any change, right? An amendment means something else in the Constitution, but here it just means any change. An open rule says you have lots of time for debate, right? You can add amendments, and a closed rule says no. And the House Committee, the House Rules Committee, decides how much debate, how much time will you be given to debate, and what amendments will be allowed, right? And based on that, it may or may not allow for a vote, right? If you get a bill and you think, oh, I might want to vote for this bill, but I want to make this change, right? And the House Rules Committee says, no, there will be no amendments to this bill, then you vote no because you're not allowed to engage in that process, right? If they want a bill to pass quickly, right, they make a closed rule, they say no debate, no amendments, either you vote for it, yes or no. That's an up-down vote, right? But the Rules Committee is very important. And the Rules Committee is a position that you can have that is different than being on the committee of, say, Armed Services or Environmental Services Committee, right? So being on this committee lets you deal with that topic. Being on the Rules Committee allows you to choose the rules of debate, which is very informative. And then a third committee, there's got to be something in this mess, like a lynch or something. The third party deals with the ways and means, right? How are we funding this? Anything that requires revenue has to go through the House Ways and Means Committee. Excuse me. I apologize that I'm like coughing right now. Just I forgot to bring water. This mask has way more length than I thought it would have. Okay. So now we actually have a debate. Let's say that the House Rules Committee, it comes out of the Environmental Committee. We have something to debate, right? The House Rules Committee says there will be time for debate. The next part is this idea of a filibuster. And a filibuster is a tactic where you continually hold the floor so that the bill won't go through. Now in the House, you can't do this, right? In the House of Representatives, it's not possible because the House Rules Committee sets up a certain amount of time, right, that you're allowed to debate. In the Senate, there is no clear rules committee. There is a rules committee, but it's not set up in the way that the House is. And so any senator, as long as they hold time, can keep a vote from happening. It used to be the case that a senator can say, I filibuster and I want to take up this time. I want to take up all the time to filibuster debate on this topic, whatever the topic may be, from now until the end of the session. And they don't have to physically be there. Eventually the rules changed, right, slightly, that if you're going to filibuster in the Senate, you have to physically be there communicating. We saw this, Rand Paul did this recently. And some older senators used to do this a lot, where they come in the morning and they speak until their voice gives out. They go for the entire time, right? They're not allowed to leave at any point for a filibuster to continue. So typically it used to be a little more disgusting process, right? The individuals would find ways to continue talking and staying on the floor. Rand Paul spoke for several hours, right? And then he needed water and he needed a break, right? But the filibuster works that way to sort of prevent action. And it used to be that in the Senate, any one senator could say, I don't want to deal with this yet, so I'm going to hold off on this. And so what they needed, right, was a vote, right? And this is what's called cloture, right? And a cloture vote requires 3/5, which is 60 votes in the Senate, to impose a time limit or to end debate. Typically what happens in the Senate is before you have a vote on a bill, you have to have a cloture vote. And this allows the minority party, right? Remember, the Senate is the place where things slow down. The Senate is things where we're supposed to be cool and reflective, and we're supposed to have time to think about things. And it's supposed to be where moderation occurs. It's supposed to be that trusty aspect of government. And so until about 10 years ago, right, it was the case that if one party didn't want it, you needed to get 60 votes and invoke cloture to continue along the process. What happens about 10 years ago is this idea of reconciliation. And it allows certain votes to occur and ignore the filibuster. And the rules have sort of weakened more and more. And now, despite the fact that the Democrats have opposed lots of bills, reconciliation has been used to avoid the filibuster and not force a cloture vote, right? Technically, right, both the skinny bill and the Supreme Court Justice Barrett, excuse me, the filibuster should have worked because Democrats can say, I want to debate more and more and more, and prevented the vote until after the election. However, reconciliation allowed them to avoid that aspect, right? For the same reason, right, because of that, it is likely that cloture is no longer an aspect, right? The Senate will no longer try and look for 60 votes to solve issues. Now the majority party will just overwhelm the minority party, right? There's no longer a push to sort of respect for that 60 vote threshold, right? And because both parties have violated it, it's no longer a tradition, right? Which means even if it's in the rules, there's nothing really stopping them from just taking the votes and just forcing an end to the debate. In the Senate and in the House, you have amendments. An amendment just means any change to a bill. When I ask you a question about amendments in the test, I will only ask you about amendments to the US Constitution. That's the only thing I ask you. I will not ask you about amendments in any other context. So even though here when I'm talking about Congress, I'm talking about amendments as changes to bills, when I ask you a question about amendments, I'm referring to amendments to the US Constitution. Because I don't like the overuse of terms, right? And in political science, you're going to see the terms come up in context. I don't want you to have that standard here because I'm just not learning too much. The other part is a hold. Now, it used to be the case that senators, if it dealt with their state, they could ask for that state to withhold communication on that issue for a period of time, right? If it's about the M1A1A mistake, and I'm from the state that it's being produced, I can say, I would like you to hold off on this issue, a senatorial hold. Those are all possible. And then we talked about voting and reconciliation, right? After you go through the committee, and then the House Rules Committee, or the Rules Committee on the Senate, right? Which there aren't as many rules about that debate, right? There's no Rules Committee, and there's no formal Rules Committee, right? It has to go through another committee, right? And then, right, if it makes it through, right, the initial committee, the initial standing committee of that deals with that topic, and then it goes to this other prospect, whether it's the House Rules Committee or the filibuster in the Senate, then it goes to the floor for debate. And only then when it goes to the floor for a debate, are we back on track of what that schoolhouse rock type of way of looking at a bill. Even when it's voted in favor in the Senate, it then has to go to the House, right? And the bill can be modified in the House and Senate. So why do we have that conference committee? Because those bills can up being different and you have to reconcile those two. After that, right, you still have a presidential veto, right? A presidential veto can occur and stop this whole process. And if the president vetoes any act of Congress, it needs 2/3 vote in each house to be overridden. The likelihood that the House of Representatives and the Senate is controlled by one party and the president is a different party is highly unlikely. Remember, we're an electoral college. So typically, whoever controls the Senate also will control the presidency, right? There's a lot of overlap there, right? Because if more states go to an electoral college for that person to become president, that party also means those states typically voted with those parties as well, whether they be Democrat or Republican. Now, there has been some turnover here and there, right? And there are midterm elections, of course, but for the most part, we don't have that aspect. So when you need 2/3, typically you don't have enough votes to get a 2/3 override. And if there is a 2/3 votes override, the president may not veto at all. Remember, these are humans behaving rationally. They might say, well, if 90% of the people in elected offices are going to vote for this anyways, I'm not going to veto because then they're going to override my veto. And if you veto and then it's overridden, it makes it look like you don't have as much power in the system. So you're only going to veto things in which you don't expect them to be able to override it, right? Your behavior is very different. The other part is a pocket veto. So the president, right, at the end of a congressional year, Congress is passing a lot of stuff. And this is typical, like throughout the congressional session, you don't have a lot of stuff. And at the end of the year, they pass like 100 things, right? They just, whatever they can crank out. California does this, Nevada does this. Like at the end of the legislative session, you crank out all these bills. You just put everything up to a vote. You say, okay, we have run out of time for debate. Now let's vote on everything we can possibly vote on and just see what gets passed through. What that allows is there's a bill or an issue that comes to the president's desk, the president can do what's called a pocket veto after the end of the legislative session, in the last 10 days. So before the last 10 days of legislative session, Congress wants to pass as much as possible, but because it's always at the last minute that everything's getting passed, a lot of that stuff in the last 10 days gets pocket vetoed. Where the president does nothing, it essentially dies because laws need the signature of the president to go into effect, right? So it dies, and then it's considered the next year, can be considered the next year, but it dies in that. It does not become law in that year. So a pocket veto is very powerful. A veto requires a 2/3 override, which becomes very strong. I wanted to, before I get into constituents, I don't think I'm that far behind. I wanted to make sure if I didn't. Okay. Just want to make sure I don't miss anything. I already have most of the exam written, so I don't want to like not cover something in the exam. All right. So how does Congress decide? We talked about this right already. Your constituents are the people in the area, right? The electorate is the people who vote in that district. Your constituents are all the people in your district, right? Whether they vote or not, right? And sometimes you have to keep your constituents happy or they'll vote you out, right? Oftentimes when we see high mobilization of voters, if we see a lot, right? If we see a dramatic increase in the total number of voters in the United States in this election cycle, it is likely that the incumbents, the people who are in office, will get thrown out, right? Voters increase in numbers to punish. They do not increase in numbers to reward. We know this about human beings, right? If someone's doing a good job, you're like, okay, you're doing a good job over there. If someone's doing a bad job, you're like, I need to do something to get you out of the way, right? That's normal human behavior, right? If someone's doing okay, you just leave them alone, right? If they're doing a bad job, you punish. So a lot of times when you're worried about getting reelected, you don't necessarily need, because you've already gotten elected once, you don't really need different voters. You need voters who weren't there before not to vote, and you need the people who voted for you in the first place to just stay the course, right? And so sometimes it's about not shaking the vote very much. Whereas if you're not incumbent, right, if you're trying to get elected, you say all of these things need to change, right? And because all of these things need to change, you're trying to convince the public that they should vote the person out and vote you in so those changes can occur. So when we're talking about constituents, behavior is very different for an incumbent versus someone trying to get into office the first time. The challenger has a very different strategy. Other than how Congress decides through elections, there's also interest groups. We talked about interest groups before, right? That they can mobilize the public against you. So you don't want an interest group working against you to mobilize, but you might need an interest group to mobilize the people that support you, right? So you don't want to upset someone who's against you, but you also want to make sure that the people who are for you are activated and mobilized. You need a lot of money, right? So money influences. Why are some elected officials not as strong on certain issues? Because they need funding, right? They need funding, right? Now, some of it's electoral, right? Biden has to be, right? Biden can't come out against fracking and that be part of an aspect where he will lose certain states, right? Pennsylvania, some states he cannot be out against fracking, right? Other states, right, he has to be sort of accepting of certain behaviors, right? Most presidents, if asked whether or not they support prostitution, would be against prostitution. But that doesn't mean they boycott all funding from places in Nevada, right? Specifically, there are brothels that contribute to campaigns, right? Because they want to make sure that that's not an issue the public discusses, right? They would be against it, but funding makes it so where they don't really want to talk about those issues, right? I mean, realistically, Nevada is the only state, and therefore, if you challenge both presidents, they would both denounce it, right? But it is part of Nevada's economy, and so therefore, Nevada would be much more likely to fund the candidate who wouldn't pass any law against it, right? So that campaign funding impacts their behavior. And that's an extreme example. I'm just using an extreme example. I'm not trying to justify it. I don't have a moral stance, right? I'm just saying that if you asked any presidential candidate whether or not they support prostitution, clearly their answer would be no. But none of them would suggest that they need to intervene in the way Nevada runs its state, which has legal prostitution in certain areas, right? That's the aspect of it, right? Of course, they would say no. But why get into that issue if they don't have to? And some funding comes from Nevada that wants to be left alone from federal influence. Interest groups have legislative scorecards. We all know about the F rating from the NRA, right? If you don't have an A rating from the NRA as a conservative, then you're in trouble. But if you don't have an F rating from the NRA as a Democrat, as a liberal, then you're also in trouble, right? Legislative scorecards tell you a lot, right? Right? Not Bernie Sanders. Certain Democrats proudly have an F rating from the NRA. They take that as a badge of honor, right? AARP is not the same thing. AARP, right? Everyone wants a good score, but the NRA, you want different scores based on your party allegiance, right? And then the last part is party discipline. Biden and Trump, right, have aligned their parties to certain expectations, right? The Democratic Party is not the Green Party, right? The Green New Deal is not the platform of the Democratic Party because that's how the presidency works, right? They formed that platform, which doesn't apply. Trump's platform is very different than the Republicans' party platform before 2016, right? The platforms match certain behaviors. Therefore, if you don't align with the party platform, the party will punish you, right? Any individual who is too far out of line from their party will face punishment. Now, the part about this, it's a little more complex. I think we have enough time. How many more slides do I have? I have a lot. We may fall. Okay. I don't know if we'll fall behind. We'll save it for another time. We're going to talk about political parties a little more later. You need to balance how much do you want to hold with the party versus the benefits of not holding with the party, right? There are benefits to disagreeing with your own party. Bernie Sanders made his name not aligning with the Democratic Party. AOC is as popular as she is because she does not align with the standard Democratic Party. There are benefits to going against the party and consequences. And so party discipline has two edges to it, right? One is I can punish you by not giving you funding if you don't stick with the party platform, but also by distancing from the party platform, you can have more recognition, right? There's benefits to conformity, and there are also benefits to standing out, right? And all of you should know that aspect. That should be very normal to you, right? You don't want to stand out too much or negatively, but you don't want to conform too much. You want to stand out a little, right? Especially if you're in a group, right? If you want to decide the activity that you're doing, standing out a little bit might benefit you more than the conformity of the group. I just started discussing this. Okay, so party unity vote is typical. At least 50% of the members take a particular position and are opposed by at least percentages of the other party. So party unity votes are very clear in the Senate, right? All of the Republicans voted to confirm, right? All of the Republicans voted to confirm Justice Barrett. All of the Democrats voted against her, right? That's a party unity vote. Now, we typically say only 50%, but party unity votes are high, like 95, 100% now, right? Most votes are split Republican, Democrat. We have a lot of polarization. That's a party unity vote. A roll call vote is when your vote is recorded individually. Now, I talked about McCain, so I'll just take a second here. The Democrats wanted a roll call vote for the skinny bill because they wanted people to be able to see and point at people who voted for the skinny bill to say, those are the people, I can look at them and hear them say yes to the skinny bill. And the Democrats wanted them to look at them and say, I can blame you, and that's part of a roll call vote. Roll call votes increase accountability because you are seen, right? Someone sees you vote. And it is possible that a roll call vote is why John McCain changed his mind. He said, am I really going to come up, right? We can't really speak to his mind completely, but there's a belief that he said, am I really going to say on camera in front of all these people that I think we should get rid of this healthcare act without a replacement, right? And so he walks up, he puts his hand up, he seems sort of changing his mind in the moment, and he votes no. And it changes the outcome, right? Roll call votes are very powerful because they create accountability. You can see your person by name voting on camera. So it's hard to deny, right? It's hard to deny when you run into, an electoral campaign. And then also it plays on their emotions, it plays on their beliefs, right? And then it makes it very clear on how to respond to those things. You do have leadership PACs, right? This is funding for the leadership. You have committee assignments. We talked about committee assignments. Right? Why are committee assignments so important? And then access to the floor, right? This is the House Rules Committee matters most in this case, right? Am I going to allow debate on this issue? And if I don't allow debate on this issue and say I'm a conservative and I know the conservatives have won, by not allowing debate, I don't allow the opportunity for the Democratic Party to say something or damage my argument in some way or introduce some amendment that would change the bill the way that we like it, right? If I don't have to reach across the aisle, why would I, right? If you don't have to reach to the other party, why do that? Your party is aligned different ideologically than the other party, right? So typically when we see debate, it's when the party says, I need the support, right? Democrats in 2010 had to open up to debate. They did need some Republican support to get the Affordable Care Act passed, right? So that's why we had more open debate. Right? There's also a lot of nuanced stuff. The floor time is very important. Do you have access to the floor? How much time do you get to speak? Also, if the party is determining how much access to the floor, that means, right, your committee assignments, your access to the floor, that means to influence your electoral chances. The more you are seen speaking on the Senate floor or House floor, and the more time you have, the more important committees you're on, the more likely you are to be reelected. If you're on the Armed Services Committee or the Ways and Means Committee, you're much more likely to be elected. So the whip system is also part of this party influence, right? If I know what you support, right? The whips know whether or not you support a piece of legislation, right? That's their job, right? The job of the whip is to know whether or not you support a piece of legislation. If you don't support a piece of legislation, other part of the job is to influence that legislator through some sort of aspect, right? Now, if you are a whip, you never want to compromise. You don't want to change the bill. Because if you change the bill, even a small change, you might lose other votes, right? If I have 10 people in a room and one person doesn't like it, I'm like, what if I make this other compromise? Then someone else will, then I won't like it, right? And you're juggling. Compromise is juggling and trying to make everyone happy. That doesn't work very often. What whips are better at is incentives, right? Stay with the party vote, and I will get you more funding in your next election. Stay with the party vote, and I'll help get you an endorsement from the president. Stay with the party vote, and I will give you some pork spending before the bill changes. Pork spending, right? Incentives were the tools of a whip to get people to vote when they weren't as willing to vote. The last aspect about party influence is called log rolling, and I'm pretty sure I've discussed this, but I want to be very clear. Log rolling is a legislative practice. If you vote for my bill, I vote for your bill. And typically the argument is, I wouldn't have voted for your bill otherwise, right? If you're a Republican and you want to pass some VA bill, and I know that that's not a good VA bill, but I want to pass a different VA bill, right? Say you want to pass something that makes tuition cheaper for veterans, right? Well, veterans already have free or no tuition, depending on the process. Most veterans have free or no tuition, right? So you're like, that's not a great bill. It's sort of just redundant, right? So I'll vote for it if you pass my bill, which provides dental care to like TRICARE for dependents in the military, right? And we both don't really love that bill, but we exchange votes. So you vote for my bill and I vote for your bill. That's log rolling. Log rolling is very, very common because, in part, that you may exchange votes that you don't like, but you also might just hide your vote, right? If you're a Democrat and you're dealing with Republicans and like, hey, would you be willing to vote for my bill? You might say, oh, what do I get in exchange? You may have already agreed that you think you should vote for that bill, but you don't ever want to give away your vote for free. So you say, you know what? I will vote on your parking bill that I don't really care about. And then you vote on my, healthcare bill that you don't really care about, whatever it is, right? And we aren't as concerned, but we're exchanging votes so we both get our want. And this happens the most on the agricultural committee. The agriculture committee, everyone wants to give things to farmers for different reasons, right? If you're on the agriculture committee, it doesn't matter if you're Democrat or Republican. You want to give things to farmers that happen to exist in your area, right? Conservatives, just by nature of geography, conservatives are more likely to represent ranchers, right? Ranchers are typically represented by conservatives. Not that they are conservative, but if you're in Texas, there's more ranching and you have a conservative senator, right? Nevada and California, you have more farmers and more Democratic leadership. And so both in the agriculture committee, they both want to give subsidies away, right? Why do we have subsidies for soybeans and subsidies for dairy? Because conservatives really wanted subsidies for dairy in order to help the dairy farmers that support them, right? And, right, Democrats really wanted soybean subsidies to help those individuals that live in their communities, right? So sometimes log rolling works that way. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It might lead to an overextension of services. It's not really corruption, but right, when we think about Congress, it's not functional unless there is some exchange. And remember that ideal of pluralism, that compromise is better and moderation is better. The belief is that moderation and compromise is better. And so log rolling is a sort of not perfectly clean way of describing how that works, right? It's a compromising factor that exists. The last part is the presidency, right? Obviously, the presidency can do a lot of damage or good by endorsing a candidate. I want to make sure. Yeah, I'm not. All right, so there are some partisan groups. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. We're going to come back at the very end and discuss it. But I'm going to get through all the slides, but I'm going to come back on Thursday and sort of do a little bit of review going to Congress, just so we're ready for the exam. There are some partisan groups, right? The House Freedom Caucus is very, very partisan. Most caucuses are issue-based and therefore have Republicans and Democrats. Partisan groups are much more rare because you already have alignment. So the House Freedom Caucus, part of the reason why you have the House Freedom Caucus is that it didn't really align with the Republican Party. So they had their own conservative ideals within the Republican Party, which is more conservative, so necessary, but typically there are other aspects. Now, starting in the 1970s and 80s up until today, we have a lot of polarization. Districts are homogenizing, right? And what do I mean by that is that if you live in this Las Vegas area, you're becoming much more liberal. Everyone is sort of liberalizing in this area. And so if you live in Las Vegas, in this area, more and more people, and there's a higher concentration of liberals. If you are living in a rural area, there's a more concentration of conservatives. And so therefore the districts are becoming more homogenous, and there isn't much as diversity of opinion. There's more sociological diversity, but typically what we see is very diverse communities with shared political values, right? Very democratic, liberal, otherwise diverse communities. So all these minorities and different identities, but they're all in one democratic liberal party. And then a much more rural area, which is more homogenous in sociological approaches, more white, religious, conservative, right? But because they're both becoming more homogenous with fewer differences politically, the individuals who represent them are becoming less and less connected. And we call that polarization, right? Democrats are going further, remember my left because it might be a very own thing, right? Democrats are becoming more liberal, right? Republicans are becoming more conservative, and they're getting farther and farther apart. And therefore, compromise is less likely, even if we think compromise is valuable, so much so that compromise doesn't seem as valuable today, right? It used to be very important that bills were bipartisan in Congress. Now, being bipartisan is not important, right? You want to be far enough left that you can't be punished for working with the right, right? And we're seeing kind of a switch back, right? We're kind of seeing a switch back to say, I'll work with anybody to fix this. And usually when there's a crisis, party matters less, right? Party matters less right now because of COVID, but under any other conditions, you would not work with the other party. Okay. Actually, let's just come back here when we get to oversight. I'm going a little slow, but I'm also definitely losing my voice, and I have a long week. So we're going to stop here. We are at the other congressional powers. If there's anything that needs to be discussed or you need to ask me questions, I have office hours, but you can also email me. We can WebEx. I'm available a lot, so if you need me help, you have a lot due coming up. Remember to look at it. Remember, you should see an assignment pop up tomorrow. When the paper assignment pops up, remember that you have to do a paper. You cannot pass this class with a paper. Otherwise, everyone have a good day.